The Subcommittee on Human Rights and the Law will come to order. Welcome all to today's hearing. It is great to see a packed house. It demonstrates the intensity of interest in this subject. I want to thank you, Ranking Member Blackburn, for working so hard and so closely with me to develop this important bipartisan hearing, and I want to thank each of our witnesses for your participation today. Throughout history, transformative technologies have emerged with the potential to disrupt societies, economies, and politics profoundly and sometimes very quickly. Machine learning and artificial intelligence may be such a technology. AI capabilities are growing rapidly and in ways even its creators cannot predict. And already it's changing our lives. American families are now threatened by AI-enabled scams, made far more sophisticated through this technology than traditional spam email or sham telemarketing calls. Today we will hear from Jennifer DeStefano, who was targeted by a scam using a deepfake of her 15-year-old daughter's voice to fake her kidnapping and extort a ransom payment. AI also has profound implications for civil rights, for the criminal justice system, for our democratic and constitutional processes, and for our privacy. Its potential impact on the future of work could include fundamental shifts in education, in recruitment, candidate screening, and hiring, and perhaps even more significantly, rapid disruption of labor markets as certain professions are automated. This technology has profound implications for the future of warfare, as kill chains are automated and predictive technology influences and mediates competition between nation states. As AI technology develops, great powers competing in an AI arms race, engaged in strategic competition, where AI is influencing the decisions made by leaders and militaries, face a different and new risk of escalation and miscalculation. And some influential technologists and engineers, including prominent figures and prominent leaders of the industry, warn of existential risks, ranging from catastrophic political destabilization to the development and deployment of weapons of mass destruction, to catastrophic cybersecurity threats, and to unforeseeable and unknown forms of risk that may emerge alongside more and more powerful forms of artificial intelligence. Our study of these technologies and associated risks should not blind us, of course, to this technology's extraordinary potential. For example, cancer diagnoses, the development of new life-saving drugs and therapies, productivity growth, and the new forms of technological innovation that AI itself could help us to unlock. But at a moment like this, it is imperative that Congress understand the full range of risks and potentials to ensure this technology can be developed, deployed, used, and regulated consistent with our core values, consistent with our national interest, consistent with civil and human rights. So I look forward to a productive conversation with this talented and extraordinary panel this afternoon. And with that, I turn to the ranking member of the subcommittee, my colleague from Tennessee, Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am delighted that we're getting the subcommittee off the starting blocks today. So I thank you and your team for the good work on those efforts and focusing on something where we do share an interest, which is artificial intelligence and technology, and the uses, as you say, for good or for bad. I do want to touch on China, and I'm so pleased that we're looking at this from the human rights angle. I've watched what has happened in China, and how they are using AI to grow the surveillance state. And they're very aggressive in this. And we know that they have used it. A good example is the way they have exploited vulnerabilities in Apple's iPhone in the iMessage system to surveil and track the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province. And the CCP uses facial recognition as a part of their tracking and a part of their data and the logging of information that they do as they're following people. And we want to dive into that a little bit. We know that China is pushing to win the race on AI. They've been very upfront about this, and they're looking to win the race on other technologies, quantum computing, 5G, 6G, anything that they see as groundbreaking that helps them to control environments, situations, and people. I think the data from McKinsey and Company should be something that we all look at and take to heart. They predict that by 2030, China's growth in AI could account for up to $600 billion in economic value. And this is exactly what they want. And in 2017, the National AI Development Plan that they brought forward, China declared its goal of becoming the world leader in AI by 2030. And they're pursuing this. They're the most aggressive filer of patents for AI technologies. They are constantly challenging our innovators through the PTAB process. So we should be watching their goals. And this should concern each and every one of us who cares about preserving the freedoms and the democratic values that we hold here in America. As we work to deploy AI technologies here, we need to make a conscious effort to consider the potential impact that those technologies could have on human rights and on how we approach issues such as data collection, data retention, surveillance, and, of course, deep fakes. This is not to say that we should halt AI development in its tracks or look at approaches that would regulate it out of existence. To the contrary, doing that would practically guarantee that China becomes the world's leader in AI, giving it the opening that President Xi wants to impose the CCP's authoritarian values around the world. But we do need to think carefully about how we deploy AI technologies in the absence of a national privacy law, which we still do not have a federal online consumer privacy protection. We also need to be careful about how we identify and how we stop unauthorized utilizations of AI, whether to surveil or to scam unsuspecting people. So to our witnesses, thank you for being with us today. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the hearing. Look forward to moving to questions.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. I will now introduce our witnesses, and thank you again for joining us today. Ms. Jennifer DeStefano, a mother from Arizona, was the victim of a horrifying scam using an AI-generated deepfake of her daughter's voice to fake her kidnapping and demand a ransom. Ms. DeStefano, I think every parent in America who read your story was chilled to the bone by what you experienced. We'll hear from you, Ms. DeStefano, about your experience to help shed light on how AI is being used to supercharge extortion-based scams and threaten the safety of American families. Dr. Alexandra Madry is a nationally recognized expert on AI and machine learning whose research focuses on how to ensure AI tools are reliable and well enough understood to be safely and responsibly deployed in the real world. Thank you, Dr. Madry. Ms. Alexandra Reeve-Givens is the CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, which works to ensure emerging technologies protect democratic values, and advance human rights. And Mr. Geoffrey Cain is a senior fellow at the Foundation for American Innovation, a technologist and author who studies how repressive governments deploy novel technologies and how democracies can respond and defend human rights. Thank you all so much for joining. Before your opening statements, we will swear in our witnesses. If you would all please rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give before the subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect the witnesses have advanced in the affirmative, responded in the affirmative. You may be seated, and Ms. DeStefano, we'll begin, please, with your opening statement. You'll see some lights indicating time, but we want to make sure you have time to tell your whole story. So don't worry too much about the clock. We're eager to hear from you, and you may begin.
Thank you so much, Senator. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, Senators. It is my great honor to speak with you today and share my experience on how artificial intelligence is being weaponized to not only invoke fear and terror in the American public, but in the global community at large, as it capitalizes on and redefines what we have known as familiar. I would like to take this moment to thank Senator Ossoff for inviting me to be here today, and I'd also like to thank Senator Blackburn for your concern on this ever-evolving topic and community threat. AI is revolutionizing and unraveling the very foundation of our social fabric by creating doubt and fear in what was once never questioned, the sound of a loved one's voice. What is familiar? How many times have you received a phone call from your child and asked them to verify who is calling? How many times has a loved one reached out to you in despair and you stopped them to validate their identity? Did you hang up on them? Did you require to call them back to make sure you're speaking to the correct person? The answer is more than likely never. The sound of a loved one's voice is often never authenticated. It is a unique identity, as unique as a fingerprint. This familiar identity is innate. It is designed by God. It is what binds a mother to their child and a newborn infant to their mother. January 20th was a typical Friday afternoon for our family, kicking off a weekend of races and rehearsals. We often divide our family across the state. It's divide and conquer. My husband was with our older daughter, Bree, training for a ski race, and I was with my younger daughter, Aubrey, picking her up from a rehearsal at dance. Bree had not raced in years and promised me that she would take it easy. At about 4:53 p.m., I received a call from an unknown number upon exiting my car. At the final ring, I chose to answer it, as unknown calls we're very familiar with can often be a hospital or a doctor. It was Brianna sobbing and crying, saying, "Mom." At first, I thought nothing of it and casually asked her what happened. On the phone, I had the phone on speaker, walking through the parking lot to meet her sister. Brianna continued with, "Mom, I messed up," crying and sobbing continually. Not thinking twice, I asked her again, "Okay, what happened?" Suddenly, a man's voice barked at her, "Lay down, put your head back." At that moment, I started to panic. My concern escalated as I demanded to know what was going on, but nothing could have prepared me for her response that she gave me next. "Mom, these bad men have me. Help me, help me, help me." She begged and pleaded as the phone was taken from her. A threatening and vulgar man took the call over. "Listen here, I have your daughter. You call anybody, you call the police. I'm going to pop her stomach so full of drugs, I'm going to have my way with her. I'm going to drop her in Mexico, and you'll never see your daughter again." As I had my hand shaking on the door handle of the dance studio, I ran inside and started screaming for help. The next few minutes were every parent's worst nightmare. I was fortunate to have a couple of moms there who knew me well, and they instantly went to action. One mom ran outside and called 911. My younger daughter, Aubrey, was standing there listening to all the vulgar threats this man was making that he was going to do to her sister. I needed her help and asked her to start calling her dad, call her brothers, call anybody. We have to find her sister. She stood there paralyzed in fear. The second mom ran to Aubrey's aid and started making calls to her dad. The kidnapper demanded $1 million. That was not possible. So then he decided on $50,000 in cash. That was when the first mom came back in and told me that 911 is very familiar with an AI scam where they can use someone's voice. But I didn't process that. It wasn't just her voice. It was her cries. It was her sobs. It was just not her voice. She said okay and left. I continued with the negotiations for the ransom. I asked them for wiring instructions, routing numbers, but they refused. Instead, they required me to get in a van with a bag over my head with $50,000 in cash to be transported to my daughter. If I didn't have all the money, then we were both going to be dead. I was shocked. At that point in time, the second mom came back to me, and she had located my husband, who had found Bree resting safely in bed. She came to me and told me that Brianna was safe, but I did not believe her because I had just spoken to my daughter, and I was very sure of her voice, and I was very sure of her cries. So I demanded to talk to my daughter. Brianna got on the phone, and she had no idea what was going on, and she kept reassuring me that she was safe. I asked her so many times, are you sure? Are you sure you're safe? Are you sure you're with Dad? I spoke to you. How can you be in both places at once? I asked her over and over again. My mind was whirling. When I finally had the reassurance I needed, I knew she was safe, and I was furious. I lashed at the men for the horrible attempt to scam and extort money. They continued to threaten to kill Bree. I made a promise that I was going to stop them, and they were never going to hurt my daughter nor anybody else again. At that point, I hung up and collapsed to the floor in tears of relief. I called the police to pursue the matter, and unfortunately I was met with it was a prank call, that it happens often, and that there's nothing that can be done, and that I probably am not in harm's way, but it's not a guarantee. They offered to have a police officer contact me, again from an unknown number, as authorities are calling from blocked numbers, but that's all they could offer. That certainly did not make me feel better. The bottom line was no actual crime had been committed, so no physical kidnapping had taken place and no money had transferred, period, the end. But that wasn't the end. It couldn't be the end. If it was the end, then how would this nightmare ever stop? I stayed up all night paralyzed in fear. Do they know where I am? Do they know where my daughter is? How did they get her voice? How did they get her crying, her sobs that are unique to her? She is not a very public person. I was wondering, are we being cyber-stalked, targeted? So many questions that were left unanswered. So I turned to the community, and the responses were overwhelming. Friends and neighbors came out of the woodwork with their stories. Kidnapping phone calls coming from their children's phones, bags of money being driven halfway to Mexico, even voices of young children nowhere to be found on social media who do not have phones. The stories kept pouring in. My own mother even received a phone call at my brother's voice, claiming to be in an accident and needing money for a hospital bill. The common response that victims received from authorities when reported was that nothing could be done. In fact, one mother I know personally shared with me how she was even mocked by her son's school and a security officer. The caller even used her son's unique nickname to self-identify. Fortunately, he was safe in class, and she was told this happens all the time, as her fear was dismissed. Money scams have been around for thousands of years. This is entirely different. This is terrorizing with lasting trauma. Even months later, sharing the story makes me shake to my core. Aubrey was approached by a boy to hang out sometime, and she concluded it was because he wants to kidnap her. That's not a normal 13-year-old thought. It was my daughter's voice. It was her cries. It was her sobs. It was the way she spoke. I will never be able to shake that voice and the desperate cries for help out of my mind. It's every parent's worst nightmare to hear your child pleading with fear and pain, knowing that they are being harmed and that you're helpless. The longer this form of terror remains unpunishable, the farther and more egregious it will become. There is no limit to the depth of evil AI can enable. The thought crossed my mind before I hung up on the kidnappers to follow through with a physical abduction of me. Was that what it would take to bring this to an end? Was that what it would take in order to have a punishable criminal offense? As our world moves at a lightning-fast pace, the human element of familiarity that lays foundation to our social fabric of what is known and what is truth is being revolutionized with AI, some for good and some for evil. No longer can we trust seeing is believing, or I heard it with my own ears, or even the sound of your own child's voice. The concept redefines and rewrites what the very meaning of familiarity means. I ask you, when your mother calls, are you going to hang up on her and call her back to make sure it's her? When your child calls in need of help, will you end the call and say, I don't believe it's really you? Is this our new normal? Is this a future we are creating by enabling the abuses of artificial intelligence without consequence and without regulation? I want to thank you for your time and attention today. Congress has a large and looming task ahead. How do we move forward as a community with this haunting reality that is plaguing us? If left uncontrolled, unregulated, and we are left unprotected without consequence, it will rewrite our understanding and perception of what is and what is not truth. It will erode our sense of familiar as it corrodes our confidence in what is real and what is not. This is a nonpartisan matter, and I've seen the hands reach across the aisle in unified concern. That gives me great hope. How to contain the ever-evolving artificial intelligence and its unknowns is not an easy task. My sincere thanks and humble appreciation for your time and attention today. I thank all of you, especially Senator Ossoff, and the Senate at large for tirelessly taking action to keep our community and our world safe from the hands of evil. I am one person, one story, but I'm not the only one, and I certainly will not be the last unless action is taken. I wish you Godspeed.
Thank you, Ms. DeStefano, for sharing your powerful and disturbing story, and we will, in more detail, investigate all of the issues you've raised. I appreciate it. Dr. Madry, it's now your turn for an opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Blackburn, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I must say it's hard to follow this testimony, in part because, honestly, it makes way better some of the points I wanted to make, but let me try nonetheless. So I want to focus my testimony on a single issue that I find particularly silent, time-sensitive, and really unsettling. How AI could undermine our whole information ecosystem, and with that, erode how our society functions and carries out democratic decision-making. The newest wave of generative AI is poised to fundamentally transform our collective sense-making, and this is due to two reasons. First, AI enables the creation of content that is not only extremely realistic, but also persuasive, even though it may be false. Second, with AI, the creation of such content is cheap and broadly accessible, making it frighteningly easy to deploy at scale. As a result, a whole spectrum of risks is emerging. Firstly, traditional spam, scam, and phishing become even easier to conduct. Also, AI can now convincingly impersonate a human online or over the phone. That was a frightening but very real experience that we just have heard about. So how will our digital platforms cope with swarms of AI-driven bots that can breeze through existing bot detection and moderation algorithms? And the worst thing is that such boosting of traditional deception is just the beginning, not the end. So AI is now able to create content that is both convincing and personalized. This means that phishing no longer needs to involve generic emails sent out to thousands of recipients. Instead, both the message and the ensuing conversation can be fully automated and customized to you. AI is also bound to transform how we think about any information campaign, be it ideological, political, or commercial. Such campaigns will no longer need to rely on a promoted message to go viral. Instead, such campaigns can be filled with generative AI that reaches the internet audience individually and in a highly personalized manner. So the hook to get you will not be some post that came across your social media. Rather, it might be a Facebook friend who is actually an AI-driven agent impersonating a human, a friend that only subtly mixes in political commentary or product endorsement into your engaging conversations. Similarly, campaigning for a cause might no longer require corralling a critical mass of people to do the outreach, be it via direct calling or letter writing. Instead, a single actor could field such a campaign by themselves, using generative AI-driven bots in place of people. Such a campaign would be equally effective, but it would need neither the buy-in from the broader population nor comparable resources. And as far as I know, this would all probably be legal too. Also, AI doesn't just produce content that is personalized. It can also make this content be personable. This could be used to make interacting with AI not only persuasive, but also alluring to the point of being addictive. What if these capabilities supercharge the attention economy, or rather distraction economy, that we are having right now? How will we feel about having our children be exposed to that? Finally, AI is ushering us into the era where any record, a contract, a deposition, a video, could be plausibly faked. How does this affect our collective discourse as well as the legal and governance system? All of these concerns might paint a rather bleak picture, but there's actually much that can be done. On the technical front, we need tools that help humans judge the extent to which a given content was generated by a human. However, these tools are still developing, and they will not be a panacea. Rather, they can provide the necessary friction that makes it harder to abuse AI capabilities. They will also not work to their full extent, and in some cases at all, without complementary policy developments. In particular, the efficacy of these technical approaches will hinge on how broadly adopted they are. Policy can accelerate this process. Policies could also require any consumer-facing AI generating content to be labeled as such. And policy could also mandate providers of AI services to implement adequate client identification and reporting mechanisms. Finally, we do need to work on AI literacy. I think that no matter what happens, in the end, the public needs to understand how to judiciously interact with AI systems and to be on the lookout for when they are actually interacting with AI in the first place. We really do not want to learn this the hard way, the way we have seen it over here. So to conclude, I am really excited about the positive impacts that AI can have, but we need to be mindful of the very real risks. And we need to get started now. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Madry. And I would note that the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Durbin, has arrived. Mr. Chairman, any remarks you'd like to make? Ms. Givens, your opening statement, please.
Senators, thank you so much for inviting me to testify. I'll say that I spent 5 years of my career sitting on the benches right behind you, so it's a particular honor to be in front of the Judiciary Committee today. The world's attention is rightly focused on the possibilities and risks of AI systems. As policymakers look to address potential harms and promote responsible innovation, it's essential that they do so with a focus on human rights, including the rights to liberty, privacy, freedom of expression, and equal treatment before the law. My testimony is going to draw us a little broader to focus on 2 areas where AI systems are already impacting these rights today: the use of face recognition by law enforcement and the impact of generative AI on elections. In previous testimony, I've described how AI systems are also harming people's civil rights and economic mobility. For example, when people are denied a job or housing based on inferences made about them by an AI system, or are wrongly accused of fraud because a government agency uses a flawed AI tool. These real-world harms are happening today. So I hope the key takeaway of today's hearing is this: that at a time when many are discussing the existential risks of AI, there are concrete issues on which Congress and the executive branch can act right now, and in doing so, demonstrate how AI can be governed in a way that centers human rights. Today, my organization partnered with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and over 60 civil society groups, urging the Biden administration to expedite its good work on these issues. These questions impact all sectors of society, and there's much that both Congress and federal agencies can do. A few words on AI and government surveillance. Last fall, many of us were inspired by images of the brave protests happening in Iran. But we weren't the only ones watching those protests. In Iran today, face recognition allows the government to identify protesters and take action against them. Face recognition has also been invoked to police women not correctly wearing the hijab, with one official threatening that violators would face immediate penalties, such as their bank accounts being blocked. In this context, AI systems are enabling a repressive regime to identify dissenters, surveil them, and automate their punishment. AI is used in similar ways in China, as we'll hear, and to intimidate peaceful protesters in Uganda, Hong Kong, and more. Such examples feel far from the US, but there have already been abuses here as well. Police in Florida and Maryland have used face recognition to identify and harass peaceful protesters, chilling Americans' free speech and right to peacefully assemble. Recently, a Georgia resident, Randall Reed, was held in jail for 6 days because a face recognition system misidentified him. There are other accounts of wrongful arrests, and these are likely just the tip of the iceberg. My testimony shows recommendations for how Congress could regulate face recognition. But importantly, this is just one area where Congress could draw a clear contrast to autocratic regimes and lead on AI right now. Turning to my second example, advances in generative AI are spurring creativity and innovation across the country and around the world, but they also raise threats for human rights, including in the context of elections. In past elections, operatives used robocalls and text to spread deceptive information. But now, bad actors could easily use AI to exponentially grow and personalize voter suppression or other targeting. Generated images can also twist public understanding of political figures and events. Videos and images have already been digitally altered to compromise public officials. Fake content is now cheaper, easier, and more convincing because of the growth of AI tools. Now, regulating in this space must be approached with care because it involves expressive conduct. There are many legitimate reasons why people use software to generate and alter content, from artists making new works, to parody, to researchers altering celebrity photos to show the hypothetical impact of skin cancer. Barring or heavily restricting such activities would harm free expression and innovation and quickly run afoul of the First Amendment. But this doesn't mean that leaders must sit idle. I'll briefly list 4 ways in which Congress could act. First, Congress could require the developers of AI systems that can be used in high-risk settings to disclose how their tools are developed and designed, and require testing for elements such as safety, validity, explainability, non-discrimination, and privacy. Second, in some instances, the appropriate framework to address AI harms will be litigation under existing laws. For example, fraud and extortion, harassment, civil rights, intellectual property, and product liability. Courts are going to have to tackle how these laws apply to new fact patterns and whether and when AI companies bear liability for the content their tools produce versus downstream users. But Congress can shine a light on these complex issues and act as appropriate to fill in gaps through hearings and reports or an expert commission. Third, there's an urgent need for AI companies to develop robust safety standards, as CEOs have said themselves in this very building. Governments are pressing companies for near-term voluntary agreements. Congress can help ensure that such agreements are developed with public visibility and engagement from civil society and independent experts. Fourth, and finally, on deepfakes specifically, Congress can use its funding and oversight to scale our nation's capacity at this critical time. This should include supporting the development of detection technologies and ensuring key institutions, like law enforcement agencies, are equipped to quickly debunk manipulated content. My written testimony shares more on each of these topics. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Givens. Mr. Cain.
Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Blackburn, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. The Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, has seized on artificial intelligence to emerge as the greatest threat to democracy and human dignity in the world today. As an investigative journalist formerly in China, I was among the first people to document and expose the horrific surveillance state that oppressed the Uyghur population in the far western region of Xinjiang. China used its vast AI-powered surveillance system, literally called Skynet. Since 2017, the atrocity has morphed into the largest internment of ethnic minorities since the Holocaust. The US State Department calls this a genocide. In December 2017, I was kicked out of China while researching my book, The Perfect Police State, which is a book about the surveillance dystopia that has been built there. Ever since then, the AI police state has expanded to alarming levels. In 2018, I moved to Turkey and for 3 years tracked down defected former intelligence officers from the Ministry of State Security, the powerful intelligence body in China with a global reach. These spies from the ministry told me that the Uyghur genocide was the beginning of an experiment in total AI surveillance. The CCP planned to enlist companies and then expand the experiment nationwide in China and globally wherever possible. In July 2017, China unveiled its national AI development plan. It called AI a historic opportunity and pledged to align development with the government's authoritarian values. China has declared its goal as becoming the world leader in AI by 2030. Recently, the CCP unveiled AI-powered alarms that notify the police when someone unfurls a banner, when a foreign journalist is traveling to certain parts of the country, and when someone from an ethnic minority is present. The companies that helped build China's surveillance apparatus operate here in America. ByteDance, the mega firm that owns TikTok, the popular social media app, stands accused by a whistleblower of running an in-house CCP committee that had access to all the app's data, including data stored in the US, contradicting the company's past testimony at other committees. This was all according to a court filing. Other sanctioned AI firms such as iFlyTech, SenseTime, and MigV have emerged as billion-dollar unicorns with the backing of the Chinese state and the involvement of American venture capital firms. In April, the Cyberspace Administration of China, a very powerful body in the country, announced draft regulations for generative AI as well. These draft rules would require content produced by chatbots to follow, quote, socialist core values and avoid information that undermines, quote, state unity. Given the CCP's enormous success at censorship so far, I believe that it will once again succeed at coercing and co-opting Chinese and American technology firms. It will transform generative AI into a tool of state oppression. We must abandon the misguided idealism of working with AI companies and government institutes in China. As long as the CCP has any control over these technologies, AI will not open the democratic discourse and it will not contribute to the betterment of humanity. China cannot be trusted to help build the guardrails for AI, which is something that Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, recently proposed at a Beijing conference on Friday. What should we do? First, America should lead the way in building democratic, human rights-first AI standards through United Nations bodies and through the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. America must ensure that China's authoritarian agenda does not influence global standards. Second, we should stop American technologists from helping China build its AI surveillance state, which many have been all too eager to do. Sanctions and export controls are not enough. This subcommittee may consider drafting a bill that metes out prison time for American executives who help develop any form of AI in partnership with a Chinese entity that could have authoritarian applications. Third, we must strengthen our chip supply chains with our allies to ensure that China doesn't get access to critical AI logic chips. We should treat the Chips and Science Act as the starting point and not the last step for this goal. We can better coordinate with our partners South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan by upgrading the Chip 4 talks now underway into a formal R&D consortium. As we enter the unprecedented age of generative AI, we must not allow China, a one-party authoritarian state, to infect the global ecosystem. We have seen the CCP's willingness to carry out genocide against its people with the help of AI surveillance systems. Now we must find ways to ensure that the words "never again" hold true. Thank you, Senators, for having me here today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cain, and thank you to all of our panelists for your opening statements. Ms. DeStefano, every parent in America can imagine the terror, the bone-chilling experience that you had, but you went through it. What was it like to hear a voice that you believed was your own daughter's, expressing such distress?
It was the most horrified I've ever felt in my life, second to actually being bedside to our youngest son, who almost passed away from a rare disorder, but luckily survived. It took me back to that place where you're just sitting there helpless. You don't know what to do. You don't know what to do next, where to go. The pain and the fear and the crying and the sobbing and the crying, calling out for my help, I can't put it really into words how haunting that is and how haunting it will probably last forever, just because that's a sound you never want to hear.
And you were told by the authorities after reporting this crime that had you wired money or sent money as demanded, they would investigate, but because no money was sent, there would be no further investigation, correct?
Correct.
And in fact,
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
Correct, exactly. Since no crime had been committed, there was nothing for them to pursue, or then there was no police report that they could take.
And in fact, my staff spoke with the Scottsdale PD, and we asked about this, and we're told the same thing, that because you hadn't transferred money, that there wasn't much to be done in a criminal context. We intend to look into that more deeply at existing wire fraud statutes and other state or federal statutes that may create a criminal claim for precisely the circumstances you raised. But I think it's clear, Senator Blackburn, Mr. Chairman, that this conduct should be criminal and severely punished. So you have my commitment to identify paths to ensuring that families are protected from what you had to go through. Dr. Madry, you have specialized, and you're here in your personal capacity. I want to emphasize this, but I think it's important for the public to understand your credentials, a substantial track record of research and leadership at MIT. You will soon be joining the team at OpenAI. You're here in your personal capacity. Based upon your experience, help the committee to understand other types of emergent scams, con jobs, forms of fraud that can emerge similar to what Ms. DeStefano experienced.
Thank you. And just for clarification, I actually just recently joined OpenAI, so just to clarify this.
Thank you.
So, yeah, what Mrs. DeStefano experience is just the beginning, not the end for sure. As I said, essentially imagine you have this technology that can impersonate humans as long as you don't have to see them like in the real life. Imagine they are perfect copies, they can really deceive you. Actually, they can be better at deceiving you than many humans would be, because they can pay attention to subtle cues in your speech and kind of your cognitive biases. So now imagine that someone can just master, thousands of copies of such agents. What are the possibilities? There's many. I go over many in my written statement. You can you can field whole persuasion campaigns using that. You can imagine that this is how we do advertising in the future. It's actually quite scary if you start, to lose your imagination.
And in fact, just last week, Dr. Madry, the FBI issued a warning that scammers are using AI to create fake pornographic videos of victims using images and clips commonly found on their social media accounts. And as the full Judiciary Committee Chair Durbin and Senator Blackburn works through some of the legislation that we are currently moving on child sex abuse material, this is an area that will require our study. With my remaining time on this first round, Dr. Madry, I'd like to address at the other end of the spectrum, not the daily threats to safety, security, but what many are discussing as the emergence of potential existential threats through lowering the cost of access to technologies that enable mass destruction, like the development of bioweapons, or catastrophic cybersecurity events, or even the emergence of properties of these technologies not yet foreseeable that could place the species at risk. How much credence do you give these warnings? Do you think they're overblown, or do you think we need to be deeply, deeply concerned about existential risk?
I think we should be seriously concerned because, again, some of these, in particular the ones about making it easier to build bioweapons or use them for better, security, breaching security, they are already here. So, it's as a theoretical possibility. So, yeah, this is something we should be worrying about right now.
We'll get into that in more detail later. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony today. Ms. DeStefano, I cannot even imagine what you went through during that period of time, but Mr. Chairman and Chairman Durbin, I think this points out why we need to look at online stalking, online harassment, and putting some of the provisions in the online space that we have in the physical space, because to be told there's nothing that can be done after you experience this. So thank you for your words. Mr. Cain, let me come to you. Having followed what has happened in China, and I'm so interested in what you learned from the former spies who built the surveillance network. I'm grateful for the reporting that you've done on this, and what I would like to know, and you may want to do this in writing for me, which is fine, more details on the types of AI applications that are being used to surveil citizens in China. And if it's easier to put that in writing and submit it, that'll be fine. I think it would be helpful information for us.
Yes, so I would be certainly eager to send you something in writing, Senator Blackburn. I could also go over some of that here if you have time for it.
Go ahead.
Okay.
And I'd also like to know what U.S. companies are sending technology to China that they are using for this surveillance.
Certainly. So the Ministry of State Security intelligence officers who had recently defected drew diagrams for me. I have notebooks full of these diagrams. They show where exactly the lines of power are drawn, and what they revealed to me when it came to Uyghur populations and minority populations in particular, that this was a highly centralized system, that all cameras, which cover nearly every square inch of this region, are scooping up facial recognition data, voice recognition data. They've also gathered biometrics on pretty much everybody in the region, and this is all scooped up to the Ministry of State Security in Beijing. This is the very top of the heap. This goes straight up to Xi Jinping himself. This is not something that anyone can argue is a local project or is being done by local authorities. It is a national plan of China's.
So it's a plan, it's coordinated, it's purposeful.
Yes, it's purposeful, and what they told me, and also they showed me WhatsApp messages. By the way, the Chinese security services use WhatsApp because even they don't trust WeChat, the Chinese version, because they think they're getting spied on. So they showed me WhatsApp messages with their spy handlers in which they're being ordered to create a nationwide project in which the plans are to expand this globally into other countries that might want these capabilities.
Thank you. Ms. Givens, we don't have, you mentioned privacy in your remarks, and of course the EU has GDPR. We have never been able to get a privacy standard on the books. And when you look at the development of AI and you think about things that need to be in place before we start down this road, and look at different applications, whether it's defense or logistics or banking or healthcare or entertainment, like a lot of my constituents in Tennessee, logistics, healthcare, entertainment, they're doing some good work there. But talk about the impact of not having a national privacy, consumer privacy standard. Talk about the impact that has on AI development.
The need for a federal privacy law in the United States is overwhelming because of the real-world harms that are happening to people now and because of the way that we're ceding global leadership on these issues. Just to draw a couple of examples, the way that our current privacy regime exists, which is a patchwork of state laws, some sector-specific laws, relies on notice and choice, this abstract idea that users can consent to their data being taken. But we know, because of the way that AI uses people's data, that that simply isn't the case. We are beyond a regime where users actually opt into any of these systems about how our information is used on a daily basis. It's why we have to have baseline rules of the road established in a federal law to limit the collection, sharing, and use of people's private information. When we look at deepfake audio and video, the source material for that is people's private photos and audio recordings that have been shared and used at scale. You can also think in the advent of generative AI, how much information we share with a search bar in any given day. Now think about the private information people are going to be sharing with a chatbot. How do we map over to make sure that those are secure environments as well, and that people can have trust in these systems for them to develop? The last example I'll give is in the use of AI when it's used to discriminate against people in employment, lending, or housing. All of that is powered by data-driven inferences that a privacy law could help address. And the final thing is that some of the model privacy laws that have been introduced get at these questions of algorithmic transparency and accountability. So putting those two things together can be incredibly powerful. So we're getting at root cause, the vast amount of private information that is so widely available, and then also dealing very specifically with these AI use cases as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. It's good to be back in the Human Rights Subcommittee. You're doing a great job in the subcommittee. Interesting subject, artificial intelligence. I have this hearing today and 2 different briefings this afternoon, and it's not unlike that for the last several weeks, 2 or 3 different briefings a day. And for liberal arts lawyers like myself, I need them all to try to understand some of the technical concepts that we are discussing and more equally important impact that they're going to have on the lives of Americans across the board. We have several bills that we've considered before the Senate Judiciary Committee, which go to the subject of the social media platforms and any responsibility they have. The interesting thing is we have 5 bills, all bipartisan bills, Democrats and Republican sponsors, and they all passed this Judiciary Committee unanimously. And the premise behind them was the notion of responsibility on the part of the social media platforms as to what they're posting. Under Section 230, for the longest time, they didn't pay much attention to what was being posted. Now they're starting to pay attention. And that's led to a very active discussion within the ranks of Democrats and Republicans on the Hill about how far we should go in holding them responsible or liable for misconduct. Ms. Reed Givens, welcome back to the Senate Judiciary Committee. We unanimously approved the Stop CSAM bill, a bill I introduced to crack down on proliferation of child sexual abuse materials online. Your organization, for some reason, opposed the bill. One part of the bill your organization took particular issue with is a provision that pierces Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and allows CSAM victims to sue platforms that host, store, or otherwise make this illegal content available. We had a classic example at a hearing. A young lady at the age of 15 thought she discovered a true boyfriend on the internet, was enticed to send sexually explicit videos and photographs to this person who put them online. She's tried to contact the social media platform that posted them. They wouldn't get back to her. They wouldn't accept any responsibility. They wouldn't remove them. She's been going through this for 20 years now. She's attempted suicide 3 times. She can't hold a job because this person eventually, whoever is releasing it, finds her and releases the information and the videos again to haunt her along the way. I heard echoes of your argument against the Stop CSAM Act in a recent interview you gave to Bloomberg. In discussing potential liability of a platform like I've described, when a generative AI tool causes harm, you noted that generative AI tools, and I quote you now, do involve users engaging in expressive conduct, end of quote. I'm not sure I understand the expressive conduct of someone who's posting sexually explicit videos of a child. And I also don't understand that it would be expressive conduct when I listen to Ms. DeStefano's experience. It seems as though a company that releases a tool that can clone a person's voice should be able to predict some of the ways the tool would be misused. And if they don't put sufficient safety measures in place, they should be held legally accountable. That to me sounds just obvious. So I'm worried about your phrase expressive conduct and your opposition to our bill. Would you like to explain?
I would, Senator. I run an organization that focuses on human rights and the impact of technology on regular people around the world. So the issues that you're phrasing are quite literally the hardest set of opposing tensions that we deal with. And the reason we approach these questions the way that we do is not by any means that we want to limit the ability of victims like that to seek redress. It's how we worry about the impact of those legislation leading to platforms who have a profit motive and who act when they're scared of liability to over-police other types of conduct that are lawful and are expressive. So we worry about the downstream effects of the heavy thumb of regulation. Now, that doesn't mean by any measure that we want companies to turn a blind eye to this or to be inactive. We believe in every force of market pressure, encouraging them to take those responsibilities deeply seriously.
What would you mean by market pressure?
So, for example, the way that platforms now have advertisers potentially threatening to pull their ads if they don't think that they have responsible codes of conduct on their platforms, if they're not enforcing that in meaningful ways. So we, and my organization actively pushes those companies ourselves to be responsible and thoughtful in how they're acting, to be transparent in what they're doing, to be consistent in their approaches. But there's the additional hammer of legal liability. We worry about the long-term effects of how that changes in platforms and leads to over-takedowns of what could be expressive conduct in other settings.
See, you talk about the heavy thumb or whatever of government. What we have now is not a heavy thumb. We have a hands-off. We stand by the sidelines and watch this poor victim, watch what happened to Ms. DeStefano, and to argue that we are somehow suppressing the market, perhaps we're asking for responsibility, accountability in the market. And if you made a decision to put a car on the road that was really cheap and you're going to make money on it, unfortunately the brakes are awful, you pay a price for that. So the expression of the market took second place to the safety of the people driving the car and those around them. So I just have to tell you I disagree with your premise that the market is more important than the individuals who are the victims of it. And I think that asking people to be held accountable for what they have produced and what their actions result in is as basic as justice in America. And to ignore that to say Section 230 or something like it should continue and stop this child sexual abuse material online exploitation, I think that it goes way too far. Please respond.
Thank you, Senator. Just to be clear, I'm not worried about protecting the market in an abstract notion. I'm worried about protecting other users who are posting lawful content, but for whom automated content filtering and some of the other provisions that companies would use, if they were worried about legal liability, would lead to over-removals. So for example, when we apply these types of mandates, if companies suddenly get worried, and this has happened in the instance of the DeStefano bill that was passed by Congress with very noble, understandable intentions to address the scourge of sex trafficking online, we also now understand, analyzing those effects, that sex workers have had a harder time finding online spaces to find community and express their concerns. And that's been documented in terms of the effects. So there is absolutely no questioning the intent of Congress and the very real harms that you're trying to address. But I'm saying that there are unintended consequences for other lawful users in the ecosystem.
So the question is whether we accept the premise that those who have these online platforms have any responsibility to police content, particularly when we're talking about child exploitation and trafficking. For God's sake, there's got to be a line we can draw that protects the marketplace but still doesn't exploit innocent people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you. Thanks, Senator Ossoff, for having this hearing. As one of the authors of the Sester-Foster bill, I happen to be very proud of it. And the consequences that you've described for the sex workers have to be addressed. But that's not a reason to try to protect the victims of trafficking or the victims of CSAM or the victims of fentanyl or the victims of a variety of, a plethora of other evils that the tech platforms know they are enabling and propagating and empowering. And as somebody who has written a variety of legislation and enforced it, legislation can never be wholly good. We have to accept that there will be other consequences, intended or unintended, that we need to safeguard against. But let me just come right to the point here. We've had a number of hearings. One of them involving Sam Altman, you referred to it, Mr. Cain. In that hearing and in the subsequent hearing held in the Committee on Intellectual Property and Copyrights, involving another 4 or 5 witnesses, everybody agreed Section 230 does not apply to AI. Do members of this panel disagree? And if so, please
I not necessarily agree or disagree. Actually, I just don't know what is the answer here. Like, it's very clear what's happening on the technical level. Now, how do we interpret it from the legal perspective? Like, that's something that is unclear to me.
So I also don't have a formal position on this. I think it's going to be there's something courts are going to have to figure out, and it's going to be a very fact-specific inquiry. I think that the arguments for 230 protections often will not apply in generative AI systems by any measure. The goal that Section 230 is meant to promote is allowing users to create and express themselves in an online environment. And often what we're seeing with generative AI is less about user expression, right? It's user putting in a query for medical advice. And that's very likely just the company spewing something back as opposed to something that the user is actually generating or creating. So I think and Senator Wyden has been clear about this as well, it is a very different fact pattern than what 230 was generated for. The one exception that I think of is when an individual, for example, might use an image generating tool for their own expressive purposes. It's them that's using that tool in a particular manner. That's where I think there's just a little bit of a question of where the facts will go, and we need to think that through.
So how would you enforce Section 230? Deep fake by deep fake? Impersonation by impersonation? I'm not sure I understand.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, Senator. To be clear, I think there are different factual scenarios for how generative AI might be used and where the line of liability should fall. There are the developers of the AI tool, there are the deployers of the generative AI tool, and then there are users. And they're all making different choices that might trigger different types of liability.
But what about the platforms?
So it depends what we're counting as the platform in this instant, right? If So for example, a generative AI tool that is, it would not typically fall in the bucket of 230 by any measure. So the point that I'm making is that there are moments when it is actually going to be the end user that is making that tool do something intentionally bad. And my instinct here is that the user should be the one who is mainly responsible for that, for what they are doing.
Well, my takeaway from this panel is that we need to clarify Section 230 to say it doesn't apply to AI. Because if it does, we're in a whole new world of hurt.
I do think that there's an awful lot that courts will be able to figure out just through this simple question of where is aiding and abetting liability. The straightforward shield, if you can't litigate it, that 230 provides, I agree that that very unlikely applies to generative AI tools at all. Instead, I think you're allowed to pierce through, and then you get into the question of who's doing the conduct where. And I think that's where there's going to be a really fruitful discussion of where you apportion that liability and the responsibility that we want for the platforms, for the generative AI tools to make sure they can't be misused.
I'm not willing to let the courts legislate. I think we have a responsibility to legislate, and we have a responsibility to protect people who may be victims, and we're moving in that direction. We're also working on legislation that would establish an oversight agency, some independent entity that would set common sense rules and a licensing regime for certain uses of AI, not to discourage any form of free expression, either through that legislation or through any rewriting of Section 230. We want to encourage innovation and startups in AI the same way that Google and Facebook were able to take on the IBMs of the world, the great giants, through their innovation. And we want to support and encourage people who are doing it in their garages, startups. But we also want to avoid repeating the mistakes that we've done through social media, which literally got halfway around the world, as Mark Twain used to say about lies, before the Congress got out of bed. And we're still trying to make up for lost time there through the Kids Online Safety Act and other measures. Basic rules of the road can be a sustainable foundation on how we move ahead with AI. So I would be interested, my time is up here, but any of your written comments on these kinds of proposals would be greatly welcome as we go forward. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. And Ms. Givens, I think that this discussion about who has liability is essential as we discuss potential regulation and how issues that arise from this technology may be treated in the courts. Let's discuss that in a civil rights and criminal justice context. As you noted in your opening statement, there was recently a man, Mr. Reed, in Atlanta, Georgia, who was arrested and held in jail for 6 days on suspicion of a crime committed in a different state because of a false match through facial recognition technology. So let's just begin by acknowledging for the record, Ms. Givens, these tools and technologies are hardly foolproof, correct?
That is absolutely right, and we are seeing the errors in those systems deeply impact people's lives today.
There are a whole range of applications in the criminal justice context that raise troubling questions. Let's focus on this facial recognition question for the moment, and let's discuss a hypothetical. If a police department uses an AI-driven facial recognition tool and makes an arrest, or perhaps a prosecutor brings a charge on the basis of a match using that tool, and it turns out that the arrested or charged individual is innocent, and a study reveals that the underlying facial recognition tool has ingrained in it some racial bias or is less accurate in matching black faces than white faces, and a civil rights claim is brought against the department or against the DA's office, where might the liability rest? Is it with the department and the prosecutor who used the tool? Is it with the producer of the tool? Is it with the AI model that the producer of the tool licensed? Is it with whoever curated the data that trained the AI model? Your take, please.
So sadly, that's not a hypothetical. We've seen that these systems do have statistically significant differences, particularly for people of darker skin. When we look at the few examples that we know in public record of misidentifications, those are all black men so far that have been wrongly arrested. And that's only the tip of the iceberg, because right now people don't know when it's an AI tool, when it's face recognition that's being used to generate their arrest. So there's a huge information asymmetry here where people don't even know that they are the subjects of these tools. And that's the case with face recognition, but also many of the AI decision-making tools that we could also talk about today, whether it's in housing, lending, employment. I do think, without question, the responsibility, first and foremost, lies with law enforcement in the case of face recognition technology. If you are going to be making an arrest, you need to make sure that you are doing so under the Constitution on a reasonable basis, and you need to be complying with all of your constitutional obligations in that setting. And right now, the accuracy concerns of face recognition raise that issue, but also other concerns as well with how the use of face recognition impinges on people's ability to express themselves, to move freely through society without thinking that they are being surveilled. So the primary responsibility lies there, and it's not going to see action until Congress steps in to legislate. We're seeing some states and local governments step in to limit the use of face recognition by law enforcement, but we need Congress to act to make clear what the obligations are and to mandate, for example, that a warrant is required in those circumstances.
Let's take a case that is emerging and will likely emerge more frequently when we think about the predictive uses of this technology, how vast data sets, much of it foraged from public domain, or of course in the case of federal or state or local agencies from law enforcement databases or data sets that they may purchase or to which they license access, being aggregated, analyzed to train models that make predictions about risk of criminal activity geographically or even at an individual level. Let's just take an example where such a model is trained based upon public domain and open source information, or such predictions might be made using open source and publicly available information. Is there some point at which that becomes itself a form of search by the state?
Those methods raise very deep questions as to what could amount to probable cause. The types of examples that you're talking about here come up, for instance, where law enforcement is doing social media analysis to try and indicate who might be culpable of a crime, to look at those types of data points, or, as you mentioned, to do inference analysis. And all of them both raise real questions about the accuracy and the likelihood of what they are generating really being a legitimate foundation for law enforcement action. They also raise, their simple use, raise real questions for our democracy when we look at the vast amount of data that is being collected. Again, going back to this question of commercial data privacy practices, these are people's Facebook profiles and the images that they've shared of themselves and what they think of as private settings, now giving rise to law enforcement uses. Law enforcement can purchase data about people from a data broker and use that for their investigation, not having to go through any of the traditional law enforcement requirements for a search. So what we are seeing is the proliferation of data creating these mechanisms for law enforcement to be able to circumvent their legal obligations, and that's something we need to fundamentally worry about as well.
Let's think about it in the context of fair housing laws, or laws and precedent that establish parameters for access to public facilities. Of course, technology is emerging and will be used by property owners to screen applicants for tenancy, embedded within which may be racial bias, which on its face would violate fair housing laws. How are you seeing these threats to civil liberties and consumer rights emerging, and how should Congress be thinking about responding?
So sadly, that is also not a hypothetical. Those are harms that we're seeing right now. I can give two specific instances. One is a growing number of landlords who are using face recognition technology ostensibly for security purposes on their campuses, but actually what they are doing is also being able to identify somebody who is in arrears on their rent for example, and being able to identify them in that way instead. So this is surveillance capabilities for security being instead misused in a way that impinges on people's fundamental freedoms to go in and out of their home. The other area, as you mentioned, is in access to housing. We also see this in access to jobs and access to credit and lending. Increasingly, we are seeing private sector tools that draw together inferences and data points about people. For example, their education history, whether or not they've ever had an arrest record against them, what their credit score is, whether or not they've ever been in default on something, and compiling all of those to see if somebody is suitable and eligible as a tenant or as an employee or for a particular setting of credit. Evidence shows that those often are not good predictors, and they're not fair predictors of whether or not somebody should be able to have access to an apartment. We know, for example, that education records, if you look at that, and arrest records in our country skew demographically against historically marginalized communities. And so when we're looking at that versus much more objective data, like have you paid your utility bills on time the past couple months, we're ingraining metrics and values that can really entrench and deepen inequality. And right now, there's no oversight of this. There's no requirement to be transparent about it that's meaningfully enforced, which is why it's important that federal agencies, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is doing work on this, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is doing work on this. Congress could also be using its oversight powers to look at the existing civil rights protections that we have, see how well they're rising to this moment, and then fill in the gaps to make sure people are really protected.
Thank you, Ms. Givens. Dr. Madry, would you say that the rate at which this technology is growing in capability is linear or exponential? And how do you foresee that trend developing over time?
So I definitely, if you look at the past 10 years, I would say it's exponential in a sense. There are things that 10 years ago seemed like a complete science fiction to me that now are just reality. Of course, it's hard to predict, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But again, if the last 10 years tell us anything, we should expect quite a lot of, rapid developments ahead of us. But of course, only time will tell.
To protect against risk, for example, of manipulation of biolabs or attacks on nuclear sites and critical infrastructure, is your view that emphasis at this time should be on guardrails embedded in the AI systems themselves or on defensive technology and innovation in cybersecurity?
Well, the answer should be both, because essentially I think the US government should really get its hands dirty and actually develop AI themselves, and that would be on the defensive part. But yes, the guardrails are definitely something to think about. We should just keep in mind that we can only put on the guardrails on things that we control. So essentially things that are developed by law-abiding US or other international companies. But yes, we should do both.
Things that we can control and things within our jurisdiction. Mr. Cain, you suggested in your opening remarks the need for international organizations, whether the UN or ISO, to be engaged to develop global standards. Talk a bit more about your vision for that and how you might see it working.
Yes, so thank you, Senator. The ISO has already passed a number of global standards, and also the UNESCO, so the United Nations Science and Education Organization, has also done its own standards. One of the problems with what's been passed so far is that they have allowed China to make these moves that sound that as if they are public relations moves. So in 2021, there was one standard passed out at UNESCO, and later that year, the Chinese government said that it was going to drop using AI for its social credit systems in China to follow these particular standards. But I have sources in many of these Chinese firms that develop social credit, and they tell me that AI is still being used just wildly and without any guardrails whatsoever. There's little that particular international standard did. So my vision would be something that is more enforceable under the law, something that would be required for UN member states to actually enforce or to create legislation, within each member state. So something similar to the International Criminal Court or the European Union. Now, I do know that this is not something that could happen overnight, but with the extent of the technology that we're now dealing with, I think this might be the only way to ensure that bad actors like China or even Russia or others can't, trample over the international order.
Ms. Givens, your perspective, please, on international law and artificial intelligence.
So I think we absolutely need international cooperation. Number one, these tools are used across borders. They impact people across borders. And number two, I think the values that we bring to that conversation, to Mr. Cain's point, are deeply important, and the U.S. needs to be in these spaces. There are areas where that's happening now, but we should think more about how that's integrated with the domestic agenda. So for example, the US and EU Trade and Technology Council is an ongoing cooperative effort between the US and the European Union to have alignment as they think about the governance of AI, and in particular to develop a shared vocabulary around how AI systems work and where regulatory interventions can fit in, and to talk about what standards for safety and mitigating some of the harms we're talking about online look like. So I think that's a really important example of how cooperation can happen. There's another instance, though, where we need to be careful of international agreements actually undermining our efforts to regulate these spaces at home. So, for example, right now, a number of advocacy organizations and members of Congress have spoken out to warn the administration that in a trade agreement that has intellectual property protections, for example, you don't inadvertently undermine domestic efforts to demand transparency of AI systems. So I raise that because it's an important example of how international and domestic conversations need to sync up with one another, and we need to make sure that we are able to project our vision of democratic governance and human rights in these settings around the world.
Thank you, Ms. Givens. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you. Mr. Cain, I wanted to come back to you on the second part of my initial question to you about what technologies, what U.S. companies may be sending technology to China and the CCP that they could use. And do you know of any American companies that were involved in creating or funding AI tech that was used to surveil citizens in China?
Yes, one of the greatest perpetrators of what you are saying is Microsoft. Microsoft has run an AI laboratory in Beijing since the late 1990s. It's called Microsoft Research Asia. This is the laboratory that went on for 2 decades to train many of the top AI technologists and developers in China, many of whom went on to sanctioned firms, now sanctioned firms such as SenseTime, Megvii, I'm sorry, the last firm escapes me at the moment, but major multi-billion-dollar firms. Some of these individuals are now sanctioned in addition to their companies, and they were directly involved in creating the facial recognition and the voice recognition technologies that were sold directly to Chinese authorities, to the Defense Ministry, to the Public Security Bureau, and to the State Security Bureau. Microsoft has created itself at the core of the Chinese AI ecosystem. And even I have an article here in the Financial Times just reported just this week. So Microsoft will be moving many of the AI developers from this laboratory to Vancouver because, according to the article, there have been many internal discussions about the problematic nature of what has been happening over there, that they're getting tangled up in just a really bad situation and they need to separate these operations.
Okay. And then you mentioned TikTok and ByteDance in your testimony. So a touch on how you've witnessed the CCP use TikTok and ByteDance to help build out their surveillance state.
Yes. ByteDance is, here in America, we know TikTok as the social media app with the dancing videos and the cat videos. In China, ByteDance was directly involved in working with the Ministry of Public Security to spread propaganda about the Uyghur genocide and about the atrocities against human rights there. This was a formal contract. This was set up. It was a formal relationship. It did not happen under the radar. It's something that ByteDance was directly involved in. And personally, I find it a bit ludicrous that a company that's involved in a genocide overseas can operate so openly in America. I think that's a gross, just horrific, just a failure to uphold basic principles of rule of law and human rights and democracy here. And for that reason, I think TikTok should be severely restricted on U.S. soil.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Madry, in some ways, there's a tension between what we've thought of traditionally in the AI space, training models to recognize certain patterns and images and to make predictions, and on the generative side, the production of images, video, audio, and there's the potential for the pattern recognition capabilities of AI models to be a countermeasure against the production of counterfeit, inauthentic content, such as what terrorized Ms. DeStefano. Which capability is advancing more rapidly? The ability to detect what is fake or the ability to produce it? And is that something inherent technically, or does that just reflect where the R&D money is going right now?
That's an excellent question. So in general, there is this kind of complementarity of recognizing if something is fake or not versus being able to generate something that can pass as being real or not. And in some sense, like the unfortunate dynamics here is that if I have a good detector of a fake content, I can turn, there is a technical reason for that, it into an even better generator of bad content. So what we are essentially facing here is this kind of cat and mouse game in which we really want to be ahead on the right side. And this brings me to the other point you mentioned, is the funding and incentives. I do not see that much incentives being provided for the detection of the deepfake. As far as I know, I'm sure some of the companies are doing something, but in the research space, definitely more activities on generation than on detection, which makes sense because that's what research is about. But I would love if the government provided in some way some incentives to much more work on the detection side.
Ms. Givens.
I think that's absolutely right. We need extensive and quick research into deepfake detection technology and good ways to help authenticate content so that it can be trusted and how to make that as effective as possible. I do think there are also ways to strongly incentivize the companies to play their part in doing this. And a large part of that is going to be about how existing law maps onto this. Unlike, we got into a conversation about Section 230, but unlike in the 230 context, if a generative AI tool is quite literally being used to generate a falsified image or is allowing somebody to create child exploitation material, that's the company's own tool that is doing that specific thing and surfacing that as a result. And so that's where we may well see litigation for defamation or for other things surface onto those companies themselves. So this is an area, and I talked about this in my testimony, where I think Congress can and should pay very close attention to whether existing laws are helping address these, how the liability is falling, help shape that conversation, and use that in addition to some of the market pressure and government pressure that's being on the companies right now to step up on some of these questions of how their tools are being used and the content that they might generate. And I think the combination of those two things is, it's not a silver bullet, but that gets us at least much further than where we are now on helping to address these types of concerns.
Dr. Madry.
I just wanted to add one related piece to that, is that in some sense, whenever the company that is whose tools is providing this AI, is developing this AI, if they cooperate, they can actually give us a home field advantage in this combat because they can provide some watermarking or some other capabilities to make it easier to detect that this is a fake content. Again, this is still all proof of concept prototypes right now, but it would be great to have incentives. It's much more work in this space. But the point is that we can kind of make it a bit easier for us to detect it if we have the cooperation of the industry here.
Ms. Givens, what kinds of First Amendment concerns arise?
So as I mentioned in my opening testimony, there are very good, lawful, legitimate reasons why people might want to manipulate images, right? There's parody, there's my kids messing around to see what images they can create on these tools for fun as an experiment. We've seen researchers, for example, transform photos of American cities to show what they would have looked like had they been subject to the extensive bombing that happened in Syria as a way of public education. These are all good reasons why generative images and manipulated images might have useful purposes and should be treated as a form of expressive conduct. So the tricky question comes in on how we incentivize the companies to address harmful misuses of that technology and put in the safety guards that they can to address that. For example, there are some companies already that say images of political figures running for public office simply cannot be manipulated on their platforms. The technology doesn't allow it, so that they do not contribute to election-related deepfakes. There are things that companies can do, but how we create that balance between what the companies are choosing for their content policies in a way that promotes safety but also allows parity and the expressive activities that our Constitution protects and that as a society we will want to foster. That is the challenge before us right now on how we balance those two issues.
Dr. Madry, which emergent capabilities or capabilities that are here today most excite you?
Excite me. That's an interesting choice of the word.
Or if you're not excitable, which do you believe have the greatest potential to support and promote human flourishing, human health, human well-being, and human freedom?
Okay, so that's a different, because we were talking about all the bad uses, so I'm not excited about any of them, but I'm definitely very excited about many of the potential outcomes. To me, the biggest vision that I have of positive vision about AI, and hopefully it's relatively close, is essentially having this personal tutor, personal kind of like essentially tutor who understands us, understands our learning deficiencies if we have them, understanding how we learn, and helping us learn about different issues. So essentially you can use generative AI to kind of help you kind of look at the solutions to your problems and seeing, you know, what mistakes you are making, explaining these mistakes, and so on. So we are seeing some early work on this. In particular, Khan Academy is working on such technology, and I'm extremely excited about the impact it would have on the humanity if this kind of really high-quality education could be available to everyone at minimal and ideally no cost.
And yet, and Ms. Givens, we'll give everyone the opportunity to say what they're most potentially enthusiastic about. But I just want to, because this question on education, it raises, I'm afraid to say, Dr. Madry, a question about risk. You know, when we think about the way that we sort children, the way that standardized testing regimes function to sort young people toward careers, toward educational opportunities, the capacity to make judgments about human potential on the basis of data that to this point was not intelligible is vast. The potential to use it for good, to provide personalized educational experiences that meet special needs is vast. But so too is the potential for this to constrain human freedom and to determine the choices and futures available to a human being from a very young age. Ms. Givens, how should we be thinking about regulation or best practices or standards in education?
The way you phrase it is so beautifully put. This is a privacy issue. My goodness, the type of interaction that we have with those systems, all of that potential, and there is so much. If that is also used to profile you, to say what learning differences you have as you're going through an experience, if we don't have strong federal privacy regulation, anybody could get their hand on that data, and the company could just bury it somewhere deep in their terms of service, and you wouldn't even know when you start using that tool. So this is why we need rules of the road. We need rules of the road for privacy. We need rules of the road for how people can use this information, and for people to be able to sue and bring a cause of action if they are being discriminated against based on this type of information, for example. And then, of course, you mentioned the need for responsible design. So there's legal liability, but even absent individuals vindicating their rights, we also need to make sure that companies are coming into this with a mindset of safety. And that's where entities in particular working in the education space have to be committed to equity and serving the person first, making sure that what they're doing is accommodating people's needs in learning, but not triaging the top students from the bottom and leaving the bottom just to keep circulating in that ever-reinforcing pattern. That's where questions, it's going to be hard for Congress to very specifically mandate exactly how those tools should work, but that's where general purpose legislation like algorithmic accountability, mandating transparency, mandating risk assessments for what types of harms might result from an algorithmic system, and having companies have to disclose how they're addressing those harms, that's how policymakers and regulators would be able to understand the risks of those tools and take action against them when they're harming people.
Ms. DeStefano, in many ways, your family's story sets the tone for this hearing, and you have opened many eyes across the nation to the kind of horrifying risk that Americans face from the abuse and misuse of this technology, and I'm grateful to you for coming and sharing your story with us. Before we close the hearing, are there any final reflections or comments that you'd like to make?
What I experienced was horrible. It was one of the worst 4 minutes of my life. That being said, that doesn't mean that all AI is obviously evil. Listening to a lot of different areas that it can be used for good is really inspiring. We have a young son with a genetic disorder, and my daughter Aubrey, we also spoke about, went through speech therapy for 6 years. The advancements and accessibility that AI can help these children grow and overcome disabilities is incredible. It was very difficult for us. That's why I knew what an unknown number would often mean a doctor's office or hospital is through personal experience. It was very difficult to be able to get her or both of them into developmental pediatrics and speech pathology, et cetera, to help them improve and overcome their disabilities. So I think AI, by allowing education or accessibility to certain types of specialized medicine and specialized care, that can be really beneficial. So I don't want to speak horribly negative about AI. What happened to me with my daughter was the tragic side of AI. But in the other sense, too, there's a lot of hopeful advancements that AI will do to improve life as well. So,
thank you, Ms. DeStefano. And Dr. Madry, both Mr. Cain and Ms. Givens weighed in on international law, international agreements, the potential for the need for there to be an international regulatory agency. Your view on that, as a scientist, engineer, and technologist, what is it that would require inspection? What are the standards or thresholds or capabilities that such an entity would regulate?
Well, essentially, it usually, first of all, I think we will only be learning what it is that we should be looking for. So that's why we want to have this structure and agency in place that has close touch and is paying attention to how things develop. If you ask me about the capability threshold, I would put it essentially roughly at the state of the art right now. And then as we see how the technology develops, which again, we could be able to keep close track of, and what are the new risks, we might either lower it or make it higher. But yes, I would just want to understand exactly how is this AI used, for which purposes, to what extent can we mitigate certain bad uses of this, and essentially also understand where we as the whole world, not only the US, are in terms of emerging AI capabilities. So if there is some threshold to be exceeded, well, we want to know it sooner than later.
Ms. Givens, what actions must Congress take to stay on the critical path toward ensuring that the emergence of this technology facilitates human flourishing and human freedom rather than enabling the abuse of power?
Congress needs to look at specific use cases like the face recognition example that I gave, which probably requires specific legislation to address those harms. But then there's an across-the-board effort that Congress could make as well, which is to get to this question of mandating transparency and mandating disclosures of how companies are looking at questions of safety, validity, their fitness for purpose, whether they discriminate, whether they violate people's privacy. We need to establish that as the baseline analysis for any company whose tool could have a high-risk use to go through that process and to do it not just internally, but to publicly disclose how they're thinking about those risks and what they are doing to mitigate those risks. We can't have accountability without that baseline road of the road because we literally don't know how the harms are going to manifest, and we can't just have individuals trying to fight this David versus Goliath battle. So if we talk about algorithmic accountability, Congress can step in there in a meaningful way to try and really start that conversation, and then have ongoing oversight of how well our civil rights laws and product liability laws are rising to the occasion as well. So I think there's steps Congress can take now, like legislating around algorithmic accountability, and then there's oversight power that Congress can have too of how this sector continues to evolve. And above all, I think one of the big pieces, somebody mentioned earlier that they're not a technologist, Senator Durbin said that. We need non-technologists to feel they have a seat at the table. We need public voices to have a seat in these conversations. So right now, governments around the world are talking to some of the largest companies about the safety standards they're going to adopt, and that's good. But there's a role for Congress to help make that a much more public conversation where civil society advocates and regular people have a seat at the table as well. And that's another area where Congress can use its oversight authorities now to help drive that conversation forward quickly, but in a meaningful way.
I want to thank all of our witnesses for appearing today and for helping us work through these questions. I thank my colleagues who attended for a productive discussion. After what we've heard today about the risks and the opportunities, it is clear that the Senate must continue and accelerate our study of machine learning, of artificial intelligence, and, Ms. Givens, to the point you made and Senator Blackburn made, get our act together on a national privacy law. Without national privacy legislation, our efforts to control the abuse of these technologies are substantially reduced. And so that is an urgent task for the U.S. Congress. The hearing record will remain open for 1 week for statements to be submitted into the record. Questions for the record may be submitted by senators by 5 p.m. on Tuesday, June 21st. The hearing is adjourned.